As we work through the complexities of life, we obviously face a whole variety of different problems, different levels of severity. So sometimes problems are easy and simple and straightforward, like easy problem, easy solution, but a lot of times, many times, not so much. So a lot of times we face problems which are not as complex, but painful, difficult, not of our own choosing, obviously, which don't have an immediate solution. Problems which are difficult, painful, not of our own choosing, which don't have an immediate solution. So any number of different things, like a physical problem, an interpersonal thing, maybe an internal thing, an interiority thing, right? A struggle with something emotional, psychological, spiritual, a struggle with sin, whatever the case may be. And the question is, what do you do? What do you do with that particular category of problems where, again, it's something which doesn't have an immediate solution? A lot of times I think on some level we fall into despair, We say that we're waiting, but in a certain sense we're falling into despair. So I'm waiting for the Lord to reveal His will, to say something, to do something. And so I'm waiting, I tell myself I'm waiting, but on some level I'm actually despairing because I don't really believe that the Lord's going to come through for me. And so it kind of begs the question, is there an alternative way of looking at this thing? There's no coincidence, it's actually quite providential. We're looking at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. And I love the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13 because it has a series of parables dealing with the kingdom of heaven. And 3 of them are pertinent and relevant to this particular issue today. So the parable of the weeds and the wheats, the parable of the mustard seed, and the parable of leavened bread. In all 3 of these parables, they say something really interesting about this particular topic. How can I perceive God's presence and His action in the midst of difficult and challenging circumstances? So I want to deal with these parables one at a time. So first of all, the parable of the weeds and the wheats, right? So obviously the weeds represent evil things in the world, and the wheat represents good things in the world, right? And what you find in the context of the story is that there's these workers working in the field. They're laboring to cultivate the wheat, and then they go to bed, and the next morning, oh my goodness, there's weeds amongst the wheats. They're all panicking, and they go to the master. They tell him what's happened, and they offer very generously, look, we will act on this thing right now. We will uproot the weeds from the midst of the wheats. And remember the demeanor of the master. Like before we get to what he says, he's calm. He's not worried, he's not scared, he's not surprised, he's totally even in terms of his temperaments. And then based on that, what he says to them is, don't do that. Don't uproot the weeds prematurely lest you damage the wheats. Wait until the appropriate time, the harvest time, and at that time and not before, we will separate the weeds from the wheat. Right? Now, a couple takeaway messages here, right? So first of all, the invitation obviously is to imitate the demeanor of the master, which is basically to say this: never be surprised that evil exists in this world. Never be surprised or scandalized that evil exists in this world, right? Not just moral evil, but suffering and all those things, right? This is not the kingdom of heaven. We're meant to encounter these difficult things to grow and stretch, and all these things are in service of God's providential designs, right? The way I like to think of it, there's never been a golden age in the history of the church. In the same way, there's never been a golden age in the history of the world. Every age has its difficulties and challenges. And so we're called to do what we can, to do what we must, but the underlying thing is a deep sense of trust. I trust that God has got this. God can bring about, and He will bring about, good things from even the most harrowing forms of evil and suffering and death, right? But the corresponding invitation is never given to impatience with regards to the coexistence of good and evil things in the world, right? Because again, God's got this, but also, if you think about it, a lot of times we can't tell the difference. A lot of times we can't tell the difference between something which is good for us and something which is bad for us. We're impatient, So just to think it through, right? How many times are we in a situation where it's painful, it's not of my own choosing, there's no immediate solution, therefore it must be bad? We fail to see that, sometimes things have to kind of play out. You see this, for example, in the parable, right? It's a subtle detail, subtle but important. So what you find with regards to the weeds, apparently the weeds can look like the wheat in the early stages of growth. And just to think that through, right? If that's the case, if you try to uproot the weeds prematurely, you might uproot the wheat by mistake because you can't tell the difference, right? It speaks to the fact that a lot of times we're overly enthusiastic in terms of uprooting the weeds from the world, whereas in reality we're not really being attentive to process. We're focusing on outcome. Evil is bad, and so I'm trying to uproot these things from the world, but it's important to be attentive not just to outcomes, but also process. How does the Lord want me to navigate through the complexities of life, this coexistence between good and evil things in the world? And if you pray into it, a lot of times the Lord calls you to be patient, to wait, to let things play out, right? Now, obviously that takes us to the next parable, right? So the parable of the mustard seed can be summarized in a simple line. So basically the Lord talks about this mustard seed, super small. Apparently if you look at a mustard seed in your palm, it's like you blink and you miss it. Gust of wind comes, it blows away. So this massive discrepancy between the size and the smallness of the seed and like the largeness and hugeness of like the resulting plants of like 9 or 12 feet. So again, a couple of takeaway messages. First of all, to not be distracted by that which the world finds to be important and valuable. To not be distracted by that which the world finds to be important and valuable. And we do this all the time. Here's something which is big and seemingly important and flashy, immediate results, and so clearly I'm called to invest my time and energy in that. But if you think about it, and you're mindful of the parable, and you're mindful of how God typically works, He typically starts with things which are small, hidden, and seemingly unimportant, which bear fruit over a long period of time. We'll get back to that later on. Parable of the leavened bread, right? So here's this woman, has flour, 3 measures of flour, I think it's like 15 liters, and she kneads into the flour a certain amount of yeast or leaven, and results in a ton of bread, enough to feed like 100 people, right? So what's up with that? The church fathers are really big into allegory. So what they say is like, this represents this represents that. So what they say is that with regards to the parable of the leavened bread, the woman represents the church, the leaven represents Jesus Christ, the principle of growth in the world, and what's the flour? The flour is us. Now that said, the key to kind of interpreting this particular parable is to pay attention to exactly how the woman puts the yeast or leaven into the flour. She doesn't simply put the leaven in the flour. What happens is she puts it deep within. Deep within. And so again, the leaven represents Jesus Christ, the principle of growth in the world. And so the invitation is to go deep, to invite the Lord and His presence and His grace to touch the innermost recesses of my life, the innermost recesses of my heart. Okay. A lot going on here, but I want to leave you with some takeaway messages, right? So this is a little bit abstract, but I think you can follow it, right? So to go back to what we said at the outset, what do I do when I'm facing a problem which is difficult, painful, not of my own choosing, which has no immediate solution? Like, what do I do? First of all, to ground your sense of identity in Christ the Lord. To ground your sense of identity in Christ the Lord. This is a really common thing. You're going through a situation which is painful, which is prolonged, again, no immediate solution. There's a recurring temptation to give into the lies put into your mind and heart by the devil pertaining to your identity, your value, your self-worth, and your relationship with God. So like, I'm going through this thing, it's painful. It's painful, God allows this thing, so therefore He doesn't love me. I'm going through this prolonged period of difficulty, God doesn't seem to be saving me from it, so therefore God has abandoned me. You need to steel yourself in the face of that temptation. Firmly ground your sense of identity and self-worth in all those things in your relationship with Christ, and go back to the parable of the weeds and the wheat. Sometimes I need to let things play out and trust deeply that even this situation in my life is within God's providential designs. And even right now, God is bringing about good and wonderful things in the context of this evil and wicked thing in my life, right? Now, the parable of the mustard seed, it speaks to the notion of surrender. This is really important. When we think about surrender, oftentimes we think we surrender to the Lord, so what does that mean for me? I do nothing. Well, not quite. Obviously, it doesn't mean that you take on a lot of stuff too, because it suggests that you haven't really surrendered the things to the Lord. It means in a certain sense you actually don't trust Him to bring about the final outcome. Surrender in a certain sense is like, look, Lord, I defer to you in terms of bringing about the victory, in terms of bringing about a resolution to this thing, right? What brings about the victory? It's not the horse, it's not the sword, it's the Lord always alone. But in the meantime, what do? I don't do big and flashy things which are deemed to be important and productive in the eyes of the world. I focus on that which is small and which is hidden, trusting these things will bear fruit over a long period of time. My own kind of working image is to think of it in terms of like sensible decisions. You're going through life, here's a situation that's beyond me. I surrender to the Lord in terms of the final outcome. But in the meantime, to be just really simple and natural and prudent, what are some sensible things I can do right now to move the situation along? The parable of the mustard seed. Now finally, the parable of the leavened bread, right? The invitation here is to make sure that everything is given to the Lord as they're being exposed. And therein lies the beauty when it comes to challenging circumstances which are prolonged. This is something we tend to overlook, right? But when you're going through something which is challenging and painful and prolonged, what tends to happen is like things come to the surface. Like they're always there, but because of this painful situation, these things are coming up now. I didn't realize this thing about myself. I didn't realize that I had this insecurity. I didn't realize I had this attachment. I didn't realize I had this struggle with whatever, emotional stuff, psychological stuff, sin. But the idea is that when these things come up, to be very mindful and purposeful and intentional about bringing these things to the Lord, to take that thought captive and to bring these things to the Lord. The parable of the leavened bread. Now, a lot of stuff here, but I would suggest the common denominator here is that we're invited to focus on the journey as opposed to the destination. And think about that. We're called to focus on the journey as opposed to the destination. I would suggest a lot of times when we focus on the destination, we tend to get worried and afraid. That's when questions start to come up. Where's God in my life? Is he going to start doing something? And those questions kind of fail to recognize that Jesus is, and always was, Emmanuel. God who is with me, God who is with you, God who is with us. Which means there's nothing to be deferred. Even right now, in the midst of your challenging circumstances, Jesus Christ is fully present to you in the moment. And even right now, God is working out the salvation of the world and your own salvation.